Hello, this is number 4 in my 85 book Odyssey, and this particular one is a poignant one, being as it's the second book about Edith Thompson, although this one's more about her family and how they, how they managed to cope after the death of Edith Thompson. It's a poignant story, and I must admit that I wept while writing it, although it was written quite a few years ago now. I feel particularly connected to the story because my parents knew Edith's parents, because they they were connected via the same church in East Ham, and that's where my parents used to go to, and that's where I went to as well. So that connection is quite poignant to me. Anyway, on with the video.
Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are taking a single devastating event, the highly publicized execution of Edith Thompson in January 1923, and crucially, we are turning our gaze entirely away from the facts of the crime itself. Our mission is to examine the years immediately following, the multi-decade aftermath, and the sheer collateral damage experienced by her entirely innocent immediate family. Her parents, William and Ethel, and their daughter Avis Graydon.
This is a truly unique deep dive because our source material intentionally bypasses the sensationalism that, gripped the public imagination and the press for decades. Instead, we have a forensic examination of profound, intimate grief intersecting with relentless and often malicious public scrutiny. This isn't just a retelling of a judicial failure. It is a meticulous accounting of the specific ways this unnecessary death, as the family saw it, shattered their world.
Exactly. We're looking at how a seemingly normal working-class family was forced to confront public shame, maintain deep, soul-crushing family secrets, and struggle for a new normal that seemed constantly out of reach. We want to understand the systemic cruelty they faced long after gavel fell.
Our journey begins with the timeline collapsing down to a single, terrible hour. We really need to understand the environment of absolute terror they endured in the moments leading up to 9:00 a.m. on Wednesday, January 9th, 1923.
Right. Section 1, the singular moment of shame. The sources paint an excruciating picture of 231 Shakespeare Crescent Manor Park, which is, 10 miles away from Holloway, Jeff?
Yeah, about 10 miles.
The Graydons are gathered, William and Ethel on the sofa, their adult children, including Avis, perched stiffly on wooden chairs. There's this palpable, cold terror gripping them, a feeling that the source describes as being blasted and gripped by an unseen terror. Can you elaborate on the atmosphere in that room?
Oh, it's suffocatingly domestic, which I think just enhances the horror. They are rooted in their own parlor, you see, but their whole consciousness, their senses, are focused 10 miles away on a structure in B-Wing in North London. And the atmosphere is regulated by the sound of a clock, a 7-day repeater, known throughout the house for its, terrible regularity in chiming the hours and half-hours. Every single tick was a countdown.
Wow.
You have Harold, the youngest son, trying to control his nerves by smoking furiously. The source mentions the long ash from his cigarette tumbling onto the dull red carpet, almost unnoticed. Avis, meanwhile, is described as clinging onto her eldest brother's arm, her knuckles white, her nails actually sort of chewing his shirt fabric. This wasn't merely mourning. This was the paralyzing anticipation of an event that would just irrevocably alter their reality.
It's the silent helplessness that really struck me. They're immobilized, waiting for a clock to signal the manifestation of hell occurring elsewhere. And that mechanism of death, the sources confirm, was taking place in a structure attached to B-Wing and Holloway Jail, shielded from public view by a makeshift screen.
And what's truly fascinating and deeply disturbing here is how the trauma immediately branched out beyond just the Graydon family. The official charged with verifying the death was Dr. Morton, the prison governor of Holloway. He was required by law to witness the execution and sign the official certificate of death. The source states explicitly that what he saw, he calls it a monstrosity, haunted him profoundly for the next 12 years, right up until his own death in 1935.
We have to pause on that word, monstrosity. Given the constraints of the time, the official silence maintained by the Home Office, what do the sources imply Dr. Morton witnessed? What could have been so horrific it stayed with him for over a decade?
Well, the context of execution in that era, which the press generally suppressed, often involved violent physical reactions that were anything but dignified. The term monstrosity strongly suggests that the execution was perhaps botched or involved a horrifying physical spectacle. Edith was frail, reportedly drugged in the lead-up. When the event occurred, the immediate scene, according to some early unsourced reports the family later heard, was dominated by the color red, apparently drenching her dress.
Oh, God.
So for a high-ranking official like Morton to be mentally profoundly affected by what he saw suggests a physical trauma that went far beyond the sort of instantaneous clean death the public was well told to expect.
That moment, 10 miles distant, served as a singular, invisible blow to the family in Manor Park. The sources describe that the moment the time passed and the event was confirmed, the family's previously suppressed agony just spluttered outward.
It did. The first physical collapse was Ethel's. She literally fell to the floor, as if, the source says, a great legal dagger had been drawn across her heart, leaving her briefly unconscious. William, though in shock himself, managed to act just enough to call for help, but he was completely incapacitated, really. Had to ask Avis to run and fetch whiskey from the neighbor, Mr. Bristow. He couldn't face leaving the house himself, perhaps fearing the neighbors already knew.
That reliance on a neighbor for even basic emotional aid, it just underscores how completely paralyzed they were.
Completely.
And immediately, William's initial shock began transforming into something far harder, more lasting: indignation over the sheer systemic indignity of the situation. He was a man, steeped in the social conventions of the early 20th century.
Absolutely. Think about the standard Victorian and Edwardian rituals of death he would have expected. The polished black corteges, the drawn blinds, the public display of sorrow, the formal funerals, the headstones. For Edith, there would be none of that. The law treated her body not as a human being worthy of rest, but as something to be immediately discarded, almost like refuse.
This is where we need to bring in the technical details the source material emphasizes. It wasn't just a matter of discretion, right? It was dictated by law.
Precisely. William was acutely aware that her body was to be treated with utter disrespect, like Monday morning's rubbish, as the source puts it. It was interred in undisclosed, unconsecrated ground. The specific cruelty here stems from centuries-old legislation, the Anatomy Act of 1832, which was originally designed to ensure bodies of executed felons were available for medical dissection, and the Capital Punishment Amendment Act of 1868, which mandated private burials within prison walls. These two acts conspired to deny the family any ritual of closure.
So William knew he would never have a place to mourn. She would forever be marked only in a prison governor's private notebook, recorded on a specific page in some secret home office file. This denial solidified his feeling of universal and righteous injustice. He felt whatever sin Edith might have committed, the punishment was in turn being forced upon her entirely innocent family.
Yeah, the collateral damage. And in a tragic, almost theatrical way, William had actually anticipated the required ritual they were forbidden to perform. He had secretly bought 7 black armbands in morbid anticipation. He immediately distributed them to Ethel, Avis, and Miss Vernon, who was also there. As they drank the neighbor's whiskey in the tired kitchen, preparing to leave for Holloway, they were performing a sort of preparation for mourning, but not a funeral. They were preparing for the cold, painful bureaucracy of death, not a respectful rite.
Okay, let's move to section 2. Navigating the last visit and the intense public scrutiny. The immediate task was bureaucratic: collecting the body's few permitted possessions and ensuring the boys were safe. But the journey itself was another layer of torture. They caught the 12.40 train from Woodgrange Park to Upper Holloway. The 4 of them, William, Ethel, Avis, and Harold, were just silent.
William's paranoia was completely consuming him by this point, and you have to say it was absolutely founded. We must remember that pictures of the entire Graydon family leaving the Old Bailey were splashed across the front pages of pretty much every newspaper in the land. Every journey they took was a public exhibition. The shame was suffocating. Reporters were shamelessly jostling for pictures outside their door at the station near the jail. It was relentless.
This relentless visibility deeply impacted William's professional life too, didn't it? For a man in his position, a chief clerk at a tobacco company, respectability and anonymity were paramount.
That's right. The gravity of the legal weight and the media frenzy left him feeling stunned, helpless, and impotent. He felt he'd done everything right raising his firstborn daughter, yet the extraordinary public coverage made him feel utterly inadequate, stained by the scandal. His chief emotion wasn't just sorrow, it became this debilitating, profound sense of shame. And the media made sure that shame had tangible financial consequences.
How exactly did that translate into professional fallout?
The press harassment of his colleagues at the tobacco company became so severe, so disruptive, that his employer, desperate to quell the situation, told William he had to take 6 weeks off, essentially until the matter, their daughter's execution, was no longer front-page news. And he was forced on the half pay for that period. For a man whose identity was tied to his solid professional standing, this was a massive blow, reinforcing the idea that the state's punishment was being unjustly meted out to the innocent family's finances and reputation.
Before discussing the bureaucracy of collecting the body, we have to reflect on the agony of the last visit the day before, the final time they saw Edith alive. William, trying to maintain some control, had forbidden his 3 younger boys from attending. He was worried it would unsettle Edith even further.
Yes, this pre-execution visit was described as absolutely pivotal, a memory that was permanently burnt into the family's eyes. They found Edith drugged, miserable, sort of stagnant, surrounded by wardresses. The fear and confusion had stripped her of her usual defiant spirit. She seemed almost vacant.
And as they were leaving, knowing what the next morning would bring, that last image provided the ultimate heart-wrenching pain.
It did. Edith struggled gently against the wardresses as they escorted her out of the room. Her voice was slurred, her arms softly flailing. She was murmuring and motioning directly to her father. "Take me home, Dad. Take me home." This desperate, childlike plea just highlighted the crushing mercilessness of the rule of law against this, by then, fragile woman. And it became William's defining personal failure in his own eyes, that he couldn't, despite everything, protect her or take her home.
So after the execution, they returned to collect the boys and face the mortuary itself. This was the moment of formal closure that denied any actual comfort.
It was a cold, clinical, purely bureaucratic domain, described as a pitifully plain, marble-covered room. It contained only a single wooden coffin, closed except for the final identification. William, barely holding himself together, was forced to confirm the identity of the pale-faced body. Avis, clutching his arm, was weeping silently and in her raw grief kept asking aloud why her sister would not wake up. Just heartbreaking incomprehension.
This is the breaking point for William, isn't it? He'd tried so desperately to maintain his stoic facade as head of the family.
Yes. The emotional dam finally broke. William collapsed over the coffin, his entire frame racked with grief. He finally had to be helped away by Ethel, who, interestingly, remained visibly rigid. She showed little outward emotion herself, instead directing the sustained, silent condemnation toward the downcast and, frankly, embarrassed officials present. They took Edith's few last permitted possessions, her fur coat and wedding ring, and left Holloway for the last time, haunted by this powerful sense of madness over the whole system that allowed this to happen.
But the press scrutiny didn't stop simply because the execution was over. The sensationalism continued, fueled by inaccurate reports. William felt compelled to strike back against the lies eventually.
He did, months later. William eventually wrote a desperate letter to the Weekly Dispatch, which was one of the papers that had been instrumental in driving the public fervor. He was protesting the ongoing sensationalism and just begged for privacy. He noted that the family was perpetually pointed at, steered at, photographed. It was a plea for their anonymity to be returned, for them to be left alone.
And what was his core message regarding the actual events?
Crucially, he stressed that 9/10 of what was being written about his daughter was completely untrue. This is significant because it suggests the public narrative was based almost entirely on fiction, scandal, and rumors rather than the known facts. He wanted the agony of the continuous scrutiny to stop, feeling that the lies compounded the tragedy and prevented any possibility of healing. They just couldn't move on.
Right, which leads us into Section 3, defiance, grief, and the seeds of new life. The family starts to react in different ways.
Exactly. The immediate physical denial of a burial ground for Edith. The fact that she had simply vanished into the earth without a trace or rite, this galvanized Ethel into sharp action. Her sense of incredulity and anger provided the fuel she needed to resist paralysis.
She launched a full-scale assault on the establishment through correspondence, didn't she? A letter-writing campaign.
She did. Her indignation fueled a comprehensive letter-writing campaign aimed at various politicians, including the new Home Secretary, Bridgman, and even King George V. Her family, including Edith's sister, Edith Lyles Walkinshaw, supported this, noting that if the execution had happened earlier, under the previous Liberal Home Secretary, Edward Short, Edith would very likely have been saved. They truly believed that.
That's an important contextual detail for you listening, the role of the Home Secretary. What was the political significance of that change in leadership just before the execution?
Well, the previous Liberal coalition government had a more pragmatic, often reformist approach to judicial matters. Edward Short was known for his relative leniency, often granting reprieves in capital cases. However, the murder trial coincided with a significant political shift. Bridgman, the staunch conservative who took office shortly after the murder, was absolutely not a man inclined toward compassion or flexibility regarding capital punishment. He was known for being quite rigid. For the Graydons, this political transition was viewed as sealing Edith's fate, proving to them that indifference and political rigidity, not justice, were responsible for her death.
But the establishment proved immovable. William's desperate plea to King George V received only the most cold and standard of replies from the private secretary, basically confirming the king's constitutional policy against intervening in legal proceedings once they were finalized.
It was a collective wall of official indifference, and that indifference drove Ethel and Avis to abandon written pleas and stage a direct, physical act of defiance against the institution that had taken their loved one.
Tell us about the Lilies at Holloway. This is a powerful, small act of resistance.
They timed this action deliberately. Ethel and Avis chose to arrive at Holloway Jail at 8 a.m., precisely during the shift change, ensuring maximum visibility among the wardresses and staff coming and going. Arm in arm, they walked sedately to the porter's lodge. They laid a substantial bouquet of Lily's Edith's favorite flower, a traditional symbol of purity, directly under the stark white rules and regulations sign. This juxtaposition, purity and remembrance against rigid authority, was absolutely deliberate.
How did the authorities respond to this, unauthorized protest?
Predictably, badly. Mr. Flowers, the chief porter, described in the sources as a particularly insensitive man, immediately threatened them with arrest for trespassing and disturbing the peace. Avis, however, stood her ground. Showing remarkable courage, she coolly walked to the governor's garden adjacent to the entrance, picked up a loose brick, and used it to stabilize the lilies against the wind. It was an incredibly plucky act of assertion, showing the family would not be intimidated even if they couldn't win the legal battle. They were fighting for the dignity they felt had been denied.
The sources mention a brief moment of solace they found, though. Almost a secret reassurance regarding Edith's final days.
Yes, this was crucial for their mental health, I think. Ethel and Avis managed to arrange a meeting with Miss Baker, a sympathetic wardress, at the World Tea Rooms nearby. Miss Baker provided insider information that directly contradicted the sensational press reports. She confirmed that Edith had behaved with dignity during custody and, contrary to public belief, remained absolutely convinced she would be reprieved until the very last moment. She also revealed the deep distress among the prison staff, stating that on the morning of the execution, the entire prison stood still in shock. This private testimony was a small, vital comfort, a fragment of truth against the mountain of lies the public was consuming.
Despite these moments of defiance, the relentless emotional strain took a massive personal toll on the family unit itself, causing rifts. We see William spiraling.
Yes. The inability to protect his family, the constant public humiliation, it drove William into heavy drinking. This culminated in an explosive, vicious argument with Ethel. A scene of raw domestic turmoil where she apparently called him a devastating name, an arsehole, and threatened to lock him out of the house. Our source describes this as an onslaught of venom, a desperate attempt by Ethel perhaps to expel the shared trauma, which manifested as rage against the one person she may be held responsible for failing to manage the crisis. The family was fracturing internally even as they tried to present a united front to the world.
And as the parents struggled and clashed, their daughter, Avis, began her own quiet search for stability outside the confines of the increasingly toxic Graydon home.
She needed counsel, spiritual anchoring, but the available sources of comfort were failing her. Reverend Vega, their local Anglican priest, was repeatedly unavailable precisely when she needed him most. He was often away, apparently. This void, combined with the emotional upheaval, led her to just wander past St. Thomas's Catholic Church in Forest Gate one day. Drawn in by the transcendent strains of a well-played organ, she entered. And there she found a spiritual warmth, stability, and structure completely absent from her Protestant upbringing and her collapsing home life.
This initiation led to her eventual conversion, which became the second family secret. Why was converting to Catholicism such a profound secret and source of friction in their home at that time?
Well, in the 1920s, particularly within a staunchly Protestant, respectable London family like the Graydons, conversion to Catholicism wasn't just seen as a religious change. It was a cultural and social transgression. It carried historical stigma. Anti-Catholic sentiment was still quite prevalent. It was seen as betraying the family's identity, almost. Given that the family was already fighting tooth and nail to maintain a fragile respectability, Avis adopting the faith of the other had to be hidden. It represented her radical break from William and Ethel's conventional world, a world that had utterly failed to protect her sister.
Which brings us neatly to Section 4. Avis's connections and conversion. Her world starts to expand.
It does. Avis's path to healing began not just through faith, but through a really unexpected connection with someone she only saw briefly on the day of the execution, Ruth Brown. This linkage is one of the most compelling examples of collateral compassion in the sources.
Right, the prisoner shoveling coal.
Exactly. Ruth Brown was a prisoner. Avis saw her chained to a wall, shoveling coal in the freezing yard outside Holloway's B Wing. Ruth was described as an illiterate northerner from Newcastle, serving 2.5 years for robbery. As the Graydons were being escorted past that morning, Ruth briefly laid down her shovel, a simple, silent act of respect. Avis, witnessing this small flicker of humanity amidst all that institutional cruelty, never forgot it.
And Avis sought her out after the execution. That's extraordinary. Why did she feel this woman, a convicted felon, was so important?
Avis saw Ruth Brown as a kind of go-between to her sister. They had shared the same roof, endured the same confinement, however briefly. Avis felt that by connecting with Ruth, she was maintaining a vital link to Edith, whose body and memory had been so cruelly snatched away. It was a search for shared, intimate understanding of the prison experience that her own family, outside those walls, could never provide.
And what was the dynamic of these visits?
Ruth was initially described as hard, plain, and fiercely defensive, a product of her tough life and environment. But the source notes that Ruth's personality visibly improved with Avis's consistent visits. She wasn't used to that kind of attention. She gained privileges, extended visiting time, and began to soften under the weight of genuine, persistent compassion. When Avis finally asked why she had risked punishment by showing that small, defiant act of respect on the day of the execution, Ruth provided a quote that really encapsulates the entire tragedy.
What was Ruth's profound reply?
She said, with simple northern practicality, "People is people, and death is death, no matter what they've done."
Wow.
This statement resonated deeply with Avis. It stripped away all the sensationalism, all the legal condemnation, leaving only the raw humanity of suffering. This philosophy that suffering demands respect regardless of the legal verdict became a cornerstone of Avis's emerging worldview. It contrasted sharply with the rigidity of her father's sort of conventional moral code.
This deepening compassion and her new faith converged when Avis met Simon Derry.
Yes. She wrote her name under Simon's, he was the Catholic organist at St. Thomas's, for his Saturday Bible study class. Simon was described as a gentle, lanky, docile man. Artistic, educated, living in his late father's large, cluttered Victorian house in Windsor Road. Avis was absolutely captivated by his culture, his kindness, and the stability he offered, a complete contrast to the chaos and grief of the Graydon home.
As their relationship deepened, Avis knew she couldn't maintain the secret of her identity indefinitely. The moment of revelation must have been terrifying.
Oh, absolutely terrifying. At a dinner in June, just a few months after meeting, the truth finally had to be unveiled. Simon pointed to a photograph of Avis and Edith together. Avis could no longer deflect, she told him bluntly. She was executed for murder, except that she didn't do it. You have to imagine the context here. Admitting the truth to the person she loved most after months of fear that the name Thompson would instantly repel anyone who knew the story.
And Simon's response validated everything Avis had hoped for, didn't it?
Absolutely. Simon responded with genuine shock, naturally, but quickly adhered to the highest Christian principle of forgiveness and love. He declared that the execution and the entire painful history made no difference at all to his feelings for her. For Avis, who had lived under this constant cloud of shame and required secrecy, this acceptance was the validation she desperately needed to move forward. He loved her, independent of the scandal.
But the shadow of the crime was long, and even this brief happiness was publicly challenged. We see the family tragedy collide violently with the Bywaters tragedy in a tea room.
Yes, this incident is horrifyingly abrupt. Avis and Simon were in a public place, a tea room at Jones Brothers department store, when they were recognized by Mrs. Bywaters, Freddie Bywaters' distraught mother. She threw hot tea directly at Avis, shouting hysterically that Avis's sister had killed her boy. The public recognition, the physical assault, the shock, it was a sudden, violent return to the scandal Avis desperately wanted to leave behind.
Simon immediately sprung to Avis's defense. What stands out to you about the aftermath of this shocking attack?
The restraint and compassion shown by Avis and Simon. Despite being physically assaulted, they decided not to prosecute Mrs. Bywaters. They recognized that she was suffering from obvious mental distress, acknowledging that both families were victims of the same tragedy, even if they stood on opposing sides of the murder verdict. It's an incredible demonstration of Avis's emerging maturity and capacity for empathy, realizing the Bywaters family was suffering collateral damage just as severely as her own.
Which leads us to Section 5, the final blows and the long shadow.
The end of that first year.
As 1923 drew to a close, William and Ethel might have thought they'd endured the worst, but the annus horribilis, as the Force calls it, had a few more humiliating blows to land. This concerns the auction of Edith's cherished possessions.
Yes. The final indignity of losing Edith's personal history, her material connection to the world. The sources reveal that William and Harold secretly attended the auction of Edith's goods and chattels at 41 Kensington Gardens, Ilford. These items had been bequeathed to Percy Thompson's brother, who was, shall we say, unforgiving. William hoped to buy back some small token, some remnant of his daughter's life, a chair, a picture, anything.
And the outcome?
They could not afford a single item. The prices were driven up by morbid collectors and, rubberneckers just wanting a piece of the scandal. Harold, watching his father, noted William wore a mask of absolute grief. Not only was he unable to perform a proper burial, but he was also unable to afford even a small piece of furniture or an item of clothing to preserve his daughter's memory. Everything she was, materially, had been sold off to strangers.
If the sale of the possessions was a blow, then the tragedy that followed exactly 1 year after the execution was a devastating final cut, particularly for Avis.
January 9th, 1924, 1 year to the day after Edith's execution. William and Ethel's fragile emotional recovery was absolutely tested when Simon Derry was killed in a bad accident involving a tram and a horse near Manor Park, Broadway. He was on his way to see Avis and was carrying a letter for her. The sheer compounding misfortune of this event, a random, banal accident, struck at the one source of profound happiness Avis had managed to find.
It's just an agonizing detail. The one man who loved her unconditionally, who validated her despite the shame, was taken away in a sudden, random accident.
Avis was left utterly listless. The source says she took to her bed for 10 days on doctor's orders. This loss completely rearranged the direction of her life. Crucially, though, she inherited Simon's entire estate, including the large, comfortable house in Windsor Road. This inheritance gave her the financial independence she needed, ironically, because of the tragedy. However, she had to change churches again, moving to St. Francis R.C. Church in Stratford, because she simply could not bear to look at the organist's position at St. Thomas's without being overwhelmed by sadness and grief.
Yet, Avis's subsequent life demonstrated profound resilience. She found a quiet way to honor Simon, didn't she?
She did. Avis lived her life unmarried, using Simon's engagement ring not as a hopeful promise, but as a firm deterrent for any potential suitors. That ring became proof of a love that was fulfilled, even if tragically short-lived, signaling to the world that her heart was already committed. It cemented her independence outside the social expectation that she must marry and conform.
The sources reveal a remarkable, redemptive attempt at closure regarding the other family involved, Mrs. Bywaters.
This is one of the most unexpected and moving details, I think. Years later, Avis received a brave letter from Mrs. Bywaters, apologizing for the tear room attack. Mrs. Bywaters acknowledged that both families were tragedies and completely innocent of the ultimate outcome. They began exchanging letters and even had dinners together for over a year. A quiet reconciliation.
What eventually caused that relationship to drift apart?
Time and distance, mainly, but also the realization, perhaps, that they could only truly communicate through their shared deceased children. The grief, while mutual, was specific and eventually became too painful a bond to maintain on a daily basis. It was a beautiful, but ultimately temporary reconciliation built on mutual tragedy.
Meanwhile, back at Shakespeare Crescent, William and Ethel faced the brutal reality of their social standing. They made a difficult, permanent decision to protect the future of their family name.
It was what the source calls the socially almost necessary decision. They chose to effectively wipe Edith completely from the family name, from the family history for future generations. Their future grandchildren will be told they only ever had one aunt, Avis. This decision, along with Avis's conversion to Catholicism, became the second family secret, a testament to the permanent systemic shame that had been levied upon them. To survive socially, they felt they had to erase their firstborn daughter.
But Avis retained the links that sustained her. Decades later, she found a connection to her spiritual lifeline, Ruth Brown.
Yes, quite remarkably. In 1958, during a trip to Dublin Haven, Avis was traveling, now financially independent. She discovered Ruth Brown's obituary wrapped around her fish and chips in a local paper, just by chance. The obituary noted that Ruth, the once illiterate prisoner, had dedicated years of her life to prison welfare work, a beautiful echo of the compassion Avis had shown her decades earlier. Avis took the time to visit Ruth's grave in Glasnevin Cemetery, paying respect to the woman who had showed that flicker of kindness in the Graydons' deepest despair.
That moment, decades after the fact, shows how those brief moments of kindness resonated throughout Avis's long life. But the systemic cruelty of the state had one final act to play, didn't it?
It did. The sources conclude that the final cruel act of the entire tragedy occurred much later, on March 31st, 1971. The prison authorities finally moved Edith's body from its secret location within the prison walls and reinterred it in consecrated ground at Brookwood Cemetery in Woking. However, they did this without informing the family. Ethel and William had both passed away by this point. The family were denied the right to mourn in life and were even denied the courtesy of notification after death, when some measure of peace might have been found.
Avis Graydon lived until 1977. She spent 54 years praying for her sister's soul. She outlived the scandal, outlived the perpetrators, and outlived the systemic denial.
She transformed, didn't she? From a clinging, dependent daughter into a self-possessed, independent woman guided by faith and compassion found outside the accepted norms of her social class. Her entire journey is a testament to the immense cost of this one execution, but also to the possibility of finding meaning afterwards.
Okay, let's try and sum this up. Looking back across these years, the immense cascading costs the Graydon family bore is just staggering. They endured public humiliation, deep financial instability for William, profound personal tragedies like Simon's death, irreconcilable familial rifts, and continuous systemic cruelty from the Home Office, which denied them even the basic human right to a graveside for nearly 50 years.
Yeah, this deep dive into the Graydon sources offers a really complex study of resilience alongside that suffering. Highlighted especially by Avis's journey, we see how she created her own spiritual path and sought out genuine empathetic connections like Ruth Brown and Simon Derry that transcended the suffocating shame imposed by her conventional sphere. The detailed record of the Graydon struggle is a powerful document showing how ordinary people cope when forced to live out their most intimate grief under history's unforgiving, judgmental lens. It's quite extraordinary source material.
The sources leave us with William's ultimate painful reflection. Whatever sin Edith committed, the punishment was in turn being forced upon her entirely innocent family. Okay. We are left with this question to mull over. When justice is exacted by the state and the law demands anonymity and silence for the executed, how long does the debt of shame truly last for those left behind? How deep do those ripples spread? Something for you to consider.